A century of farming couldn't prepare me for the secret my land kept. After the worst storm in living memory, the earth split open, revealing a sealed hatch that felt ancient, alien, and utterly wrong. The land has a memory. My grandfather used to say that, his hands stained with the same dirt I work today. He believed every rock, every dip in the terrain, held a story. For 30 years I'd been driving my tractor over our 40 acres, and I thought I knew all its stories. I knew the spot where my dad's old Ford pickup finally gave up the ghost in '78, and the rise where a lightning strike turned a century-old oak into a blackened skeleton overnight. I knew the land's moods, its secrets. Or so I thought. This past summer was brutal. The sun baked the fields until the earth cracked open like old porcelain. The creek my grandfather had fished in as a boy dried up to a ribbon of cracked mud. Every morning I'd look up at a vast, empty sky, the color of faded denim, and pray for rain. And then finally, it came. Not a gentle shower, but a biblical deluge. For 2 straight days the heavens just broke. The storm was a fury of wind and water that scoured the topsoil, washing away months of dust and drought in a torrent of brown water. It was on the 3rd day, when the sun finally dared to show its face again, that I went out to survey the damage. I climbed into Old Bessie, my John Deere that's more rust than paint, and the familiar diesel rumble was a comfort in the changed landscape. The air was clean for the first time in months, smelling of wet earth and ozone. As I drove toward the north pasture, the one that slopes down toward the old creek bed, I could see how much soil the storm had carried away. The field was scarred with new gullies, and rocks I'd never seen before jutted from the mud. I was halfway across the field, the tires of the tractor sinking deeper than usual into the soft ground, when it happened. Scree-chunk! The whole tractor jolted to a stop, throwing me forward against the steering wheel. The engine whined and stalled. "Damn it all to hell," I muttered, thinking I'd hit one of those newly unearthed boulders. Annoyed, I climbed down, my boots making sucking sounds in the mud. I was expecting to see the telltale gray curve of granite, wedged under my front axle. But what I saw wasn't a rock. There, scraped clean by the tractor's plow, was a slash of dark, rusted metal. My first thought was that it was a piece of old, forgotten farm equipment. Maybe a section of a cistern lid, or an old fuel tank my granddad had buried and forgotten about. I went back to the tractor, grabbed a spade, and started to dig around the edges. The mud was thick and heavy, and each shovelful was a workout. But with every bit of earth I cleared, my curiosity grew, pushing aside my annoyance. This was no water tank lid. As I cleared more of the surface, a shape began to emerge. A perfect 3 by 3 foot square of steel, flush with the bedrock that lay just a foot under the topsoil. It was thick, at least 2 inches, and pitted with age and rust. But the most unsettling thing, the thing that made the hairs on my arms stand up, was the center. Set right in the middle of the square was a large iron wheel, like something you'd see on a submarine hatch or a bank vault. It wasn't just a lid, it was a seal. I stood there for a long time, the shovel dangling from my hand, just staring. This wasn't ours. My family had owned this land since the 1920s. We were farmers, not industrialists or military men. There were no old mines, no government installations anywhere near here. This thing had no business being in the middle of my field. It felt wrong, an intruder in the memory of the land. My practical side, the side that sounded a lot like my wife, Sarah, told me to leave it. Call the sheriff, maybe the county surveyor. Let someone else deal with it. This was not my problem. But the other side of me, the part that was still a curious kid who used to dig for treasure in the backyard, was screaming. What was it? Who put it here? And most importantly, what was inside? Curiosity won. It always does. I tried turning the wheel. It wouldn't budge. It was frozen solid with rust and time. I kicked it. I threw my shoulder against it, but it was like trying to move a mountain. It was clear I needed more leverage. I trudged back to the barn, my mind racing. Every logical explanation seemed to fall apart. The barn was cool and smelled of hay and oil, a familiar, comforting scent that felt a world away from the alien object sitting in my field. I grabbed the heaviest crowbar I owned and a length of thick tow chain. Back at the hatch, I worked the tip of the crowbar into the space between the wheel's spokes. I took a deep breath, planted my feet in the mud, and pulled. The iron groaned in protest. I put my entire weight into it, my muscles screaming. For a second, nothing happened. And then with a deafening crack that echoed across the quiet field, the rust-welded seal broke. The wheel began to turn. It was agonizingly slow, each inch a victory against decades of subterranean silence. It took nearly 20 minutes of heaving and sweating to make it turn a full rotation. With the final shuddering click, I felt a change in the pressure. A low hiss started to emanate from the edges of the hatch, like a giant letting out a breath it had been holding for a century. The air that escaped didn't smell like musty earth. It smelled sterile, metallic, and underneath that, something else, something ancient and cold. I looped the chain through the wheel, hooked it to old Bessie's hitch, and climbed back into the driver's seat. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I put the tractor in low gear and eased forward. The chain went taut, the engine strained, and the entire tractor vibrated with the effort. There was a terrible, deep, groaning sound of metal scraping against metal, a sound that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. And then, with a final booming thump, the hatch lifted from its seating. I stopped the tractor and jumped down, my boots splashing in the muddy water that had pooled around the opening. I walked to the edge and looked down. A wave of cold air washed over me, so intense it felt like a physical blow. It wasn't a gradual chill, the kind you get on a winter morning. It was a sudden, predatory cold that sucked the warmth right out of the sunny afternoon. It felt like a void, an absolute absence of heat. My breath plumed in front of my face, instantly turning to a million tiny ice crystals. The grass around the edge of the opening began to stiffen and whiten with a layer of frost. The temperature must have dropped 30 degrees in as many seconds. I peered into the opening. All I could see was darkness, a profound, absolute black that seemed to swallow the sunlight. On the edge of the opening, just inside, I could make out the top rungs of a steel ladder, descending into the abyss. The cold continued to pour out, a silent, invisible river that made my teeth ache and my skin prickle. It wasn't just cold. It was wrong. It was a dead cold. I knelt closer, my hands gripping the frosty metal edge, trying to see something, anything, in the suffocating darkness below. The air was so still, so silent. And then I felt it. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a movement. It was a shift in the quality of the silence, a change in the pressure of the darkness. And from the bottomless black I felt a single chilling certainty. Something down there had just woken up, and it knew I was here. For a solid minute I was frozen in place, kneeling in the mud, my own breath fogging in the impossible cold. The feeling of being watched, of being perceived, was so powerful it was like a physical pressure against my skull. My farmer's instincts, the ones honed over a lifetime of reading the land and the weather, were screaming at me. Every nerve ending told me to slam that heavy hatch shut, pile a mountain of dirt on top of it, and pretend this day never happened. Forget the memory. Bury it deep. I scrambled back, stumbling away from the dark maw in the earth. The cold was spreading. It was a visible, creeping thing now. The mud closest to the opening was hardening, a latticework of frost spreading across it like a fast-growing crystal. A few hardy weeds that had survived the storm were turning black and brittle, their life force flash-frozen out of them. It was a circle of death, expanding with every second the hatch remained open. What in God's name was down there? A busted liquid nitrogen line? Some kind of experimental coolant system? My mind grasped for rational explanations, but they all felt thin and flimsy, like a single blanket against a blizzard. No pipeline ran through our property, and whatever this was, it felt ancient. The rust on the hatch was the slow, patient work of decades. I made a decision. It was probably the stupidest decision of my life, but it was the only one I could live with. This thing was on my land. Under it. It was my responsibility. I couldn't just cover it up and leave whatever it was festering under the pasture my family had worked for 3 generations. I had to know. I ran. not away, but toward the house. The sight of the familiar white farmhouse nestled in its grove of maple trees was a jarring contrast to the alien wound in the north pasture. The world felt split in two, the normal sunlit world of my life and the cold, dark world that had just been opened beneath it. The house was empty. A note on the kitchen counter from Sarah said she'd taken the kids into town for groceries and would be back before supper. A wave of relief washed over me. I didn't want them anywhere near this. I didn't want to have to explain it. How could I? In the utility room, I grabbed the most powerful flashlight we owned, the big mag light that took 4 D-cell batteries. I checked them. They were fresh. Then I went to the gun safe in my office. My hands trembled slightly as I unlocked it. I bypassed the hunting rifles and pulled out my old Mossberg 12-gauge. I worked the pump-action shuck-shuck, the sound a solid, reassuring piece of the normal world. I grabbed a handful of buckshot shells and stuffed them into the pockets of my jeans. Lastly, I grabbed a coil of climbing rope from the garage. I didn't know why. Maybe for getting back up if the ladder gave way. Maybe for pulling something out. Or maybe just because it felt like a sensible thing to have when you're about to climb into a mysterious hole in the ground. The walk back to the hatch was the longest of my life. The shotgun felt heavy and absurd in my hands. What was I going to do? Shoot the cold. But leaving it behind felt even more foolish. The circle of frost had widened. It was now a good 15 feet in diameter, a perfect pale scar on the green and brown field. The air inside the circle was visibly shimmering, like the heat haze over asphalt in August, but in reverse. I took a deep breath, the frigid air stinging my lungs. I clicked on the flashlight. The beam cut a sharp, white cone into the afternoon light. I pointed it down into the opening. The darkness drank it. The beam seemed to reach down maybe 20, 30 feet, illuminating the slick black rungs of the ladder, and then it just stopped. It didn't fade. It was just consumed by a darkness so absolute it felt solid. Rope tied around my waist and secured to the tractor's hitch, shotgun slung over my back, I swung a leg over the edge. My boot clanged against the top rung of the ladder. The metal was so cold it felt sticky, instantly sucking the heat through the thick sole of my work boot. "Here goes nothing," I whispered to the empty field. The descent was eerie. The only sounds were the clang of my boots, the scrape of my jacket against the narrow shaft, and my own ragged breathing, which echoed back at me, muffled and strange. The walls of the shaft were smooth, unnervingly so. Not poured concrete, not welded steel. It was some kind of seamless black material that didn't reflect the flashlight beam at all. It just absorbed it. The cold intensified with every rung. It seeped through my clothes, through my skin, right into my bones. My fingers gripping the rungs started to go numb. I had to force them to unclench and regrip each time I moved down. 20 feet, 40, 60. I paused, shining the light up. The opening was a distant square of blue sky, a world away. I shined it down. Still nothing but that all-consuming black. I must have been 100 feet down when my boot finally touched a solid surface. I cautiously put my weight on it, then stepped off the ladder. I was in a room. A massive one. I swept the flashlight beam from side to side and the light never found a far wall. It just faded into the oppressive gloom. The floor was made of the same strange, non-reflective black material as the shaft. It felt solid, but almost soft under my boots, like hard rubber. A low hum vibrated through the soles of my feet. It was a sound so deep and resonant that I was feeling it more than hearing it. It was the source of the cold. The air here was a physical entity, a thick glacial presence that made the inside of my nose burn with every breath. My flashlight beam, powerful as it was, felt like a candle in a cavern. I unslung the shotgun, holding it at a low ready. I took a few cautious steps forward, sweeping the light in a slow arc. The beam caught something, not a wall, but a structure. In what I guessed was the center of the vast, dark space stood a pillar. It rose from the floor and disappeared into the darkness above, maybe 20 feet wide. It was made of the same black material, but this was different. It wasn't inert. As my light washed over its surface, faint lines of pale blue light pulsed within it. like veins. They moved in slow, rhythmic patterns, like a sleeping leviathan's breath. I crept closer, my boots making no sound on the strange floor. The pillar was a single, seamless piece of engineering. There were no rivets, no panels, no markings, just a smooth black surface and the slow, hypnotic pulse of the light within. I reached out a hand, my fingers numb and clumsy with the cold, wanting to touch it, but some primal instinct screamed at me to stop. This was not a machine in any way I understood. It was something else. I lowered my hand, my breath pluming like dragon smoke. I continued my circle around the massive pillar, keeping the flashlight beam trained on it. Then I saw it. On the far side, there was a break in the smooth surface. It was a panel, maybe 4 feet square, set perfectly flush into the pillar. It was darker than the rest of the surface, a square of pure void. And in the center of that square was a single, hand-sized indentation. It looked like a handprint, but it had 6 long, slender fingers. I stood there, mesmerized by it, 1,000 questions warring in my head. Who built this? When? Why? The hum seemed to grow louder, the cold more intense. It felt like the whole structure was waiting, holding its breath, just like I was. My flashlight beam was still fixed on the 6-fingered handprint when from far above me a sound slammed through the silence. A deafening final clang of heavy steel, striking heavy steel, so loud it made my teeth vibrate. The echo rolled down the shaft and washed over me in the dark. The square of blue sky was gone. The hatch had just slammed shut. Panic hit me like a physical blow, a raw animal terror that clawed its way up my throat and choked the air from my lungs. I scrambled back to the base of the ladder, my flashlight beam dancing wildly against the smooth black walls of the shaft. Up. I had to go up. My rope was still tied to the tractor. It must have slipped. The hatch must have slid shut on its own. It had to be an accident. I slung the shotgun back over my shoulder and started climbing, my numb fingers fumbling for purchase on the freezing rungs. I climbed with a desperate, frantic energy, ignoring the burning in my legs and the ache in my bones from the cold. 10 feet, 20, 30. The shaft was a perfect tube of absolute darkness now. There was no friendly square of blue sky to guide me, only the bobbing, circular prison of my flashlight beam. The silence was heavier now, more profound. The echo of the slamming hatch had died, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breaths and the frantic thumping of my heart. The low hum from the pillar below seemed to have faded, or maybe I was just too focused on my escape to notice it. I reached the top of the ladder and my hands hit the solid underside of the hatch. I pushed. It didn't budge. I braced my feet on the top rungs and pushed with my shoulders, my back, with every ounce of strength I had. Nothing. It was like trying to shove a mountain. The sheer dead weight of it was immense. I hammered on it with my fists, the dull, hollow thud swallowed by the oppressive silence. "Hello, Sarah! Anybody?" My voice was a thin, pathetic sound in the vast emptiness. It didn't even echo properly, just seemed to get sucked away into the cold. The reality of my situation crashed down on me. I was trapped, 100 feet underground, in a place that shouldn't exist, with the temperature dropping steadily and my only connection to the world sealed off by tons of rusted steel. The panic threatened to swallow me whole. My breathing came in short, sharp gasps, and the blackness at the edge of my vision started to close in. No, I couldn't lose it. Not here. I forced myself to take a slow, deep breath, the glacial air searing my lungs. I had to think. The rope. I had my rope. I fumbled at my waist, my numb fingers struggling with the knot. I untied it and pulled. The rope came down, unspooling from above, landing in a soft pile at the bottom of the shaft. I'd secured it to the tractor's trailer hitch, a solid anchor point. There was no way it could have come loose on its own. Someone, or something, had untied it. Had they closed the hatch, too? The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins that had nothing to do with the temperature. Was it Sarah? Had she come home early, seen the open hole in the tractor, and panicked? It was possible. She might have thought I'd fallen in and closed it to stop the kids from getting near it before calling for help. It was the most logical explanation. I clung to it like a life raft. She'd be back. She'd bring the sheriff. They'd get the hatch open. I just had to wait. I descended the ladder again, my legs trembling this time, not from exertion but from fear and cold. Waiting was the only option. But waiting down here, in this vast, humming tomb, felt like a death sentence. Back on the floor, I swept the flashlight beam around the chamber again. It was just as empty and vast as before. The colossal pillar at its center still pulsed with that soft, internal blue light. The rhythmic beat seemed slower now, more deliberate, like a heart rate settling after being startled. I had to get warm. My core temperature was dropping fast. I was starting to shiver uncontrollably, my teeth chattering. I pulled the collar of my jacket up and huddled against the base of the shaft, trying to conserve whatever body heat I had left. The smooth wall was like a block of ice against my back. I don't know how long I sat there. Time seemed to warp and stretch in the darkness. It could have been minutes, it could have been hours. My shivering grew more violent, then slowly began to subside as a dangerous lethargy crept in. My thoughts grew sluggish. Hypothermia. I knew the signs. I had to move, to generate heat. Forcing my stiff limbs to obey, I stood up and began to pace around the base of the pillar, the shotgun held loosely in my hands. The low hum was definitely still there, a constant vibration in the floor. As I walked, I kept the light trained on the strange, seamless black surface. The pulsing blue veins of light seemed to follow me, brightening in the sections I was closest to, then dimming as I passed. It was aware of me. There was no other word for it. I completed a full circle and found myself back in front of the panel with the 6-fingered handprint. I stared at it. The flashlight beam held steady. It was the only feature, the only interface in this entire impossibly huge chamber. It was a lock, or a switch, or a greeting. The thought that had been lurking in the back of my mind since I first saw it now pushed its way to the front. What if touching it was the only way out? What if this entire thing was a test, or a trap? The cold was becoming unbearable. My flashlight beam started to flicker. The batteries were dying, drained by the intense cold. Soon I'd be in total darkness. The idea was more terrifying than the cold itself. With the light fading, my options were running out. Sit here and freeze to death in the dark. Or interact. Engage with whatever this thing was. My hand, my very human, 5-fingered hand, was shaking violently. I held it up next to the indentation. It was a near-perfect match in size, but the shape was alien. Those long, slender fingers. The flashlight flickered again, more violently this time, and the beam dimmed to a weak yellow glow. It was now or never. I took a stumbling step forward. "Okay," I said, my voice a cracked whisper. "Okay, you win." I pulled off my work glove. My bare skin screamed in protest as it hit the frigid air. My hand was pale and waxy in the dying light. I raised my hand and pressed it against the indentation. The surface wasn't cold. That was the first shock. It was warm. Not just warm, but radiating a soft living heat that felt like sinking my frozen hand into a basin of perfectly heated water. The warmth instantly spread up my arm, a blissful, shocking relief that chased the deadly chill from my bones. And then everything changed. The low hum stopped. The silence that replaced it was so absolute it made my ears ring. The pale blue lights inside the pillar flared, turning a brilliant electric white. They raced through the pillar's veins, converging on the panel my hand was touching. The light poured into my hand, my arm, my body. It wasn't painful. It was information, images, feelings, sounds, concepts I had no words for, flooded my mind in a tidal wave. I saw stars being born and dying in seconds. I saw geometries that made my head ache. I felt emotions that were not my own. A billion years of loneliness, a patient, calculated waiting, a vast and terrible purpose. The floor beneath my feet began to vibrate, a deep tectonic tremor that shook the entire chamber. I pulled my hand back with a gasp. The warmth vanished, replaced by the biting cold. The inside of the pillar was now a raging storm of white light. A deep grinding sound echoed from within it, the sound of immense gears and forgotten machinery stirring from a long slumber. A section of the seamless black floor directly in front of the pillar began to glow. A perfect circle, 30 feet in diameter, lit up with the same pale blue light as before. The light wasn't just on the surface, it seemed to be coming from within, outlining a massive circular section of the floor. With a low hiss of displaced air, the circle began to descend into the floor, like a colossal elevator. It lowered about 20 feet, and then stopped, revealing a second chamber below. This one wasn't empty. My flashlight was all but dead, but the light from the pillar and the glowing elevator was enough to see by. The lower chamber was filled with things. Long, sleek metallic pods, dozens of them, arranged in neat concentric circles. They looked like sarcophagi, or cryotubes, and from the center of the chamber something was rising. It was not a machine. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its head an oblong shape that held no familiar features. It unfolded itself from a crouched position, its movements unnervingly fluid, like a spider made of smoke. It was a silhouette against the rising blue light from below, a figure of absolute alien nightmare. I stumbled backward, raising the shotgun, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. The figure turned its head. I couldn't see eyes, but I felt its gaze lock onto me. It knew I was there. It had been waiting. And as it took its first silent step off the platform and onto the floor of my prison, the last glimmer of light from my mag light finally winked out, plunging everything outside the blue glow into perfect, impenetrable darkness. The world dissolved into two colors, the pulsing, cold blue of the pit and the absolute black that surrounded it. My universe was now a small island of terrifying light in an ocean of darkness. The creature, the being, took another step, its movements unnervingly silent on the strange floor. It was taller than I'd thought, at least 8 feet, and its silhouette was all wrong angles and graceful predatory curves. The shotgun felt like a child's toy in my hands. What good was buckshot against a shadow that had been sleeping under my field since before my grandfather was born? My mind was still reeling from the flood of information I'd received from the panel. It wasn't a memory, not in the human sense. It was a data burst, a raw stream of consciousness that had left fractured impressions behind. Loneliness, a long journey, a crash, a desperate act of preservation, waiting for the warmth, waiting for a sign. My hand, my simple, human warmth, had been the sign. I had rung the dinner bell for something that had been starving for eons. The being stopped about 40 feet away, just at the edge of the blue light. The light from below cast its long shadow back into the darkness where I stood, making it seem even larger, more monstrous. It raised one of its long, 6-fingered hands, the same shape as the indentation on the pillar, and a sound entered my mind. It wasn't a voice, it was a thought, a concept that blossomed in my consciousness without the need for ears. "You are warm." The words were not threatening, just observational. A statement of fact, like me saying, "The sky is blue." But coming from this impossible entity, it was the most terrifying thing I'd ever experienced. "We are cold. We have been cold for so long." The shotgun was trembling in my grasp. My finger was on the trigger. A part of my brain, the primal, terrified part, screamed at me to shoot, to fill the silence with the familiar, deafening roar of gunpowder and lead. But the other part of me, the part that was still processing the torrent of images and feelings, held me back. I had seen their journey. I had felt their crash. They weren't invaders. They were refugees, castaways. Another thought, clearer this time. The vessel failed. The core is failing. The cold leaks. Soon it will fail completely. All will be lost. I finally understood. The unnatural cold, the freezing of the field around the hatch, that wasn't a weapon or a defense. It was a leak. The cryosystem that was keeping the pods in the lower chamber viable was breaking down after millennia of silent operation. The pillar wasn't a machine, it was a life support system. A failing one. "You woke me," the thought came again. "The Guardian, Your warmth bypassed the final protocols. I was to awaken only when the outer shell was breached and the warmth of a new star was detected. But the breach, it was you. The star, it is you. My mind raced. Guardian, star, me. It was talking about the sun, but it was also talking about me, my body heat, my life force. They must have crashed here so long ago that the planet was a frozen rock, or maybe they hadn't known what kind of life would evolve. They just set their system to wait for warmth, for a sign of a biosphere that could support them. And I had just stumbled in and announced that the wait was over. The Guardian took another silent step forward. We need a new vessel. We need warmth. The implication was horrifyingly clear. The pods below held the last of its kind, and to live they needed hosts. They needed warm bodies. My panic returned, cold and sharp. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a prelude to consumption. My finger tightened on the trigger. But then another fractured image from the data burst surfaced in my mind. Not of stars or alien cities, but of something familiar. Water. H2O. I saw diagrams of molecules. I saw its thermal properties, its unique ability to store and transfer vast amounts of energy, of heat. Their vessel, their technology, it was all based on something else, some exotic element. They understood water theoretically, but their ship had crashed before they could properly analyze the resources of this world. The core, I croaked, my voice sounding alien and loud in the chamber. The thing that's making it cold. Where is it? The Guardian paused, its head tilted in a distinctly curious gesture. A new thought entered my mind, accompanied by a feeling of surprise. It speaks. The warmth is sentient. A schematic, a blueprint of the pillar, flashed in my mind's eye. It showed the cryochambers below, the energy conduits, and deep in the center of the pillar, a sphere of swirling, chaotic energy. The core. It was pulling heat from the surrounding environment, from the very rock and earth of my field to power the cryostasis. But it was failing, becoming inefficient, sucking in more and more energy just to maintain its state, causing the runaway freezing effect on the surface. The core cannot be repaired, the Guardian projected, with a feeling of immense ancient sadness. We can only transfer the occupants, a slow process, one by one. We do not have time. An idea, a wild, insane, farmer's logic kind of idea, sparked in my brain. It was born of desperation and a sudden bizarre sense of empathy for this ancient, dying race. "You don't need me," I said, louder this time, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "You don't need hosts. You just need heat. A stable source." I turned and pointed my dying flashlight back toward the shaft. "Up there. Water. A whole creek bed of it. Just a few 100 yards away. It's underground now, but it's there. A huge aquifer. Constant temperature. You can tap into it." The Guardian stood motionless. The idea I was proposing was so simple, yet so far outside its own technological frame of reference, it was like telling a computer programmer to fix a server by hitting it with a hammer. Water. The thought was hesitant, analytical. The fluid? High thermal capacity. Unstable molecular bonds. Potential for geothermal transfer. "Yes!" I shouted, a wild hope surging through me. "Geothermal. You can draw heat from the planet's core through the water. It'll be more stable than trying to power this thing with whatever you're using." I was talking out of my league, spouting concepts I barely understood, but the data burst had given me just enough of their language, their science, to make a guess. The Guardian stood silent for a full minute. The blue light from the pit pulsed steadily. I could feel it considering, processing. It was analyzing millennia of stored data against the words of a terrified ape descendant holding a primitive projectile weapon. Finally, a new thought came, devoid of the earlier sadness. It was crisp, decisive. "Show me." And just like that, the grinding sound returned, louder this time. The huge circular platform began to rise from the pit, the sleeping pods disappearing back into the darkness below. It rose until it was flush with the floor again. Then a section of the main pillar slid open with a hiss, revealing a small, glowing control panel. The Guardian gestured toward it with one of its long arms. With my heart in my throat, I walked toward it. Another schematic appeared in my mind. A map of my own land, but rendered in a way I'd never seen. It showed geological strata, magnetic fields, and water tables. I saw the creek not as a line on the ground, but as a massive underground river. I focused on it, on its location relative to the chamber we were in. As I did, a glowing line appeared on the schematic in the Guardian's mind, a direct path from the ship's core to the aquifer. The transfer is possible. It projected. New energy conduits can be grown. The process will be slow, but stable. The cold will recede. A wave of relief so powerful it made my knees weak washed over me. I had done it. I had saved my world and theirs with a half-baked idea about my grandfather's fishing creek. The Guardian turned its attention back to the panel. A low thrumming sound started, different from before. Not a hum of decay, but a hum of industry, of purpose. And then, from high above, I heard a sound that was more beautiful than any bird song, the deep groan of rusted steel on steel. A perfect, brilliant square of daylight appeared at the top of the shaft. The exit is open. The agreement is made. The Guardian projected. We will remain. We will not interfere. We will draw the warmth we need from the deep earth. The surface will be yours. I didn't need to be told twice. I stumbled to the ladder, my legs like jelly, and began to climb. I didn't look back. I just climbed toward the light, rung after freezing rung. When I finally pulled myself over the edge and collapsed into the blessed, muddy, sun-warmed field, I took in a huge gulp of fresh, clean air. The unnatural circle of frost was already receding, the frozen ground softening at the edges. Sarah was there. The sheriff's car was parked by the barn. She ran to me, her face pale with worry. She'd found the open hatch and the rope, untied, lying on the ground. She'd thought the worst. I held on to her, burying my face in her shoulder, my body shaking with the aftershocks of the cold and the fear. I never told anyone the full story. I told them I found an old, abandoned cistern, that I'd slipped and the lid had fallen shut. I said the cold was just a pocket of trapped winter air. They filled the shaft with concrete the next day. 12 truckloads. We covered it with soil, and by the next spring the grass had grown over it so thick you'd never know anything was there. But I know. Sometimes on a quiet night, I walk out to the north pasture. I'll stand on that spot, and if I press my hand to the ground, I can feel it. A faint, rhythmic, and steady vibration coming from deep below. It's not the cold, dying hum I first felt. It's a gentle, living warmth. The steady, quiet pulse of a new heart, beating in the memory of the land.